hear things quieting down here. Wow, it's great to see a full house here in post-COVID, whatever it is, super, right? It's been hard to get a crew out, and Sean has brought you all here, so that's wonderful. So, I mean, it's, Sean Carroll is an award-winning scientist, an author, an educator, and a film producer. I mean, he is all over the map, doing all sorts of stuff, and he's a nice guy. So we have had him here since last night. Flew in, had dinner, got up, started meeting with us at 8 o'clock this morning, met with faculty, met with graduate students, met with a class with Will Kimler, of Jefferson scholars who get degrees in a social science and in a natural science, who had read this. And that's what he's going to talk about today. It's a short book, but he says it's mostly references. But anyway, there's been an incredible 24-hour journey with Sean. But I want to tell you just a couple of little things about him. Oh, I have to stop and say, I was going to do the welcome, and Rob Dunn was going to do the introduction. But Rob Dunn got sick, and he couldn't come. And you can say, oh, he's an administrator. He's the senior vice provost for interdisciplinary programs. He's not your ordinary administrator. In preparation for this, he read 2 of Sean's books, including this one, so that he could do the introduction. So he is very sorry that he can't be here. And I'm sure, knowing Rob, he would have told better stories than I can. But just to tell you, Sean grew up chasing snakes and other animals and bringing them home and whatever else. He went to Washington University in St. Louis and got a degree in biology and took almost enough courses to get a co-major in French, which is a whole story. It shows how one faculty member can really change what happens to you. And this knowing French fits right into why he's here today. He did his PhD in immunology at Tufts Medical School. He's had honorary doctorates in science from University of Minnesota and Tufts University. He has an endowed, I'm going on here just to get this out, right? He has an endowed chair in biology at University of Maryland. He's a professor emeritus in genetics and molecular biology at University of Wisconsin. And so he does a lot of biology. And earlier today, he gave a talk on evolutionary developmental genetics, which is the field he works in, and the talk was called Butterfly Spots and Rattlesnake Tails. Quite interesting. But his other side of his life is he is the lead Howard Hughes Medical Institute Science and Educational Media Group lead, right? And he has gotten many awards in the life sciences, which I'm going to skip over. I do want to tell you he is the author of many books, some of them depicted here. His most recent book, A Series of Fortunate Events, is one of his shortest books, or is his shortest book. But I have to tell you, it is a short book. You can find the chapter on the extinction of dinosaurs, and you will never read something more exciting, where he proves that our existence here as human beings depended on a meteor hitting the world not 30 minutes sooner or 30 minutes later. Leave it at that. You might find that book pretty interesting. And of course, today he's going to talk about his book, Brave Genius. So I'm not going to go over all the books he has written, but one of them, Endless Forms, Most Beautiful, takes the title from something Darwin wrote, and is a book that many people who learned evolutionary biology or developmental biology read, and it was a cornerstone. So As I mentioned, he's with the HHMI, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and he serves as the executive producer or executive in charge of many feature documentary films. And he just came back from the Oscars. The film that he was executive director on is called All That Breathes, and maybe some of you have seen it on HBO because it's now on there. I don't know where else it is, but quite impressive. And it was nominated for the Best Documentary Film. And it sounded like a great trip to the Oscars. He also was the executive director for a film called The Serengeti Rules, which was actually based on a book that he wrote up there in that corner. And that won Emmy Awards? Right. Sorry, I want to get this straight here. So he's done all of that, and he's also co-authored introductory genetic analysis books and so on. So I do want to give you the welcome and background just to say that this presentation is sponsored by the Genetics and Genomics Academy at North Carolina State University, and this is the tagline for that: developing and using genetics and genomics knowledge to enable the flourishing of societies and ecosystems. And it is also sponsored by the Genetic Engineering and Society Center at NC State, and their tagline is integrating scientific knowledge and diverse public values in shaping futures of biotechnology. So I think you could see a little bit from this why he fits in here at NC State. And I just want to end with showing something that, so this book, of course, comes from our library, not this library here where you don't have stacks, but from the other library. And I went into the stacks to find this book, and it just is interesting to see. That's where Sean Carroll lives in our library, right next to Camus and Alice Kaplan's book on the conspirator and all these other books, right? But when you look for his other book, a science book, it lives here. It lives among a bunch of books with a lot of equations in them. So I just want to tell you that you're going to hear from a scientist who doesn't limit himself but follows his nose and his imagination and his passion. So please.
Maybe I should just sit down. Should we just stop this? Okay. Thanks, Fred. I don't know how I'm supposed to follow up on that. Thank you for a generous introduction. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. I guess this tells everybody there's nothing new on Netflix. Huh? And thanks again for the hospitality today, faculty, students, staff that have arranged this whole visit. Had a wonderful time here. Thanks for arranging the weather. That was really, really appreciated after all this. So the one thing that unites that narrative that Fred gave you, for me at least, is I'm a huge believer in the power of story. And so whether that's talking to each other or teaching in the classroom or talking to the general public or to the news media, it's really important to tell a good story. And I think that Rudyard Kipling got it right when he said that, I'm on to Brave Genius and I'm going to go to Rudyard Kipling. If history were taught in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten. And I think what's true for history is true for science and for the history of science. So tonight we're going to put this to the test. I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story about someone who had enormous influence both inside science and outside of science. And perhaps some of you know a little bit about Jacques Monod. The biologists here might know a little bit about Jacques Monod. He did win the Nobel Prize in 1965. He's really a co-founder of molecular biology. So here at the genetics hub here for North Carolina State, he played a pivotal role in the sort of modern history of genetics in the world. He worked out the first principles of gene regulation with his collaborator, Francois Jacob. I'll mention that in a second. He worked out this principle for the biochemists of allostery and the regulation of protein activity. And late in his career, was the director of the eminent Pasteur Institute, where he had done his original work. But there was much, much more to Minot. And that's why I'm going to tell you his story. And it's a story that was captured, I think, by this pearl from Henry Van Dyke, who said that genius is talent set on fire by courage. And I want to focus on the formative events that brought out Minot's courage and his talent, and which brought crucial people into his life. Now, if you had met Minot when he was in his 20s, you would have no sign of really the greatness that was to come. After he got his undergraduate degree, what it was is Minot just had trouble settling on a direction in life. He wasn't lazy or anything. He was just interested in lots of things. He grew up in Cannes. He was an accomplished sailor. So when he was about 24, he went on a natural history expedition to Greenland. 2 years later, impressed with his work, they invited him back. He turned that down to spend some time in T.H. Morgan's lab at Caltech, which is fortunate for biology in lots of reasons, because Morgan, as you know, is one of the key modern figures of genetics, but also the ship in 1936 sank in a hurricane and all but one aboard were lost. One of Jacques' first close calls. He was an accomplished rock climber. He was also an accomplished musician, and he spent time both in France and in Pasadena directing choirs. So that by the time he was in his late 20s, when he decided, and he was trying to choose between music and science, he chose science. He had not yet picked an area of study. He had not decided on a thesis project. And like many other French people of the time, he didn't see the future too clearly. In the summer of 1939, the winds of war were starting to sort of sweep across Europe. And on August 31st, Minot wrote to his father, "There will be no war. Hitler is much smarter than Wilhelm II. He knows what it would cost him. I only regret that the English are too polite with him. They should not have bothered writing him long letters. They should have told him to piss off," without any further explanation. And the very next day, Germany invades Poland. And this is meaningful for France because both France and Britain have a mutual aid treaty with Poland, and so essentially they're obliged to declare war on Germany. But then a strange thing happens, which is it doesn't erupt into a shooting war with France and Britain. Poland is sacrificed. Essentially, France and Britain really don't enter the war in earnest because just 20 years after World War I, there's no appetite for that scale of casualties and conflict. So what starts in the fall of 1939 is a long period referred to as the Phony War, where armies are mobilized, they're facing each other across borders, but nothing's happening between France and Britain and Germany. And Minot, who's now 30 years old, he's trying to decide what to do, and he's really worried that if war breaks out, he's going to get assigned to some rear administrative position, and he wants to contribute by now some of his scientific talent to whatever the war effort might require. And he decides to join the communication engineers for two reasons. First of all, he was sort of interested in the work, learning Morse code and all this sort of thing. But he also knew there was only one regiment of communication engineers, and they were based just outside Paris in Versailles. And Minot had recently become married and become the father of twin boys, and he thought if he was based just outside Paris, he'd be able to see his family. So in early May of 1940, after finishing his training, he goes back to the base, and just 3 days later, Germany invades France, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg. Now, Minot is confined to his base, and you may know the story that France collapsed pretty quickly, that while there was a lot of advance warning, Germany took the same path that it had actually taken in World War I and quickly overran French forces, so that only 10 days into the war, things looked really dire. And Jacques' only way of communicating with his wife, Odette, was by letter. He was confined to his base, and here's one of those letters. And he says, "I know that when the time comes, you will do everything so that our children live free. As far as I'm concerned, I'll never believe in the total and final victory of those people, even if it would appear to be as total and final as possible." And the discussion at the time was whether, for example, Odette, and her plan was to race to the coast and try to catch a boat to England. And Jacques would just have to hopefully somehow find his way to follow up. But sort of things got in the way, and Odette did not get to the coast, did not get on a boat, and did not leave France. And within a few weeks, France had capitulated. And eventually, by that fall, Jacques and Odette were back in Paris together with their kids. But the Paris they saw when they got back there was shockingly different. Virtually every building, restaurants, hotels, government buildings have been commandeered by the occupying Germans. They were marching down the Champs-Élysées every day, singing. And there were long lines for French people for things like bread and other staples because the German army was taking essentially all of France's production. There were not even enough calories by that fall to maintain people's body weights. It got worse when the French sort of provisional government, the Vichy government, headed by the World War I hero Marshal Pétain, met with Hitler in October of 1940 and declared that he was embarking on a path of collaboration. Now, what would the collaboration mean? Well, for Jacques' family, the consequences were quite concerning because by this time, of course, Germany had severe anti-Jewish policies and practices, and one of the first things Jacques was required to do was to register as the spouse of a Jewish person. So Odette, his wife, was Jewish, Jacques was not, but he still had to register. This is his registration. And France, which had a history of really they were harboring a lot of refugees from around Europe who were escaping, Austria, Poland, Germany, etc., and so had a sort of a really welcomed Jewish population with open arms. Now the tide was really turning. And Jacques and his friends, which were sort of in the academic and professional circles, were really taken aback. And so, for example, his friend and fellow music lover, Leon Maurice Nordman, they decided that one thing that was really important to get was information. It was hard to get information in occupied France, hard to get information in occupied Paris. By this time, the BBC was broadcasting in French back to France. Although it was illegal to listen to it, of course, people were trying to listen to it. And of course, there was a lot of information spreading by word of mouth among people, what was going on. It was hard to know the true state of the war, for example, the battle going on in Britain. It was hard to know exactly what was going on in France because there was, of course, a really tight grip on media, and the media was all co-opted by the occupying Germans. So Nordman and several friends and colleagues who were at the Anthropology Museum, the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, decided that they would put together a newsletter and share that sort of among circles of friends to update people on events as they were developing. And Jacques agreed to be one of the distributors of this newsletter. Now, Paris was occupied, France, the northern part of France was occupied, but French people still had to find a way to make a living, and Jacques had returned after France surrendered to his graduate work at the Sorbonne in Paris, and he was trying to find a thesis project. And that fall, in November, he got a result in the lab that was fairly curious. He still was not sure what he was going to study. He was doing some pretty simple experiments, and circa 1940, that's about all the experiments you could do because we didn't know much about how life worked. There was a lot to be discovered. And he was doing experiments where he mixed he was looking at the properties of bacterial growth in various defined media, defined conditions. He noticed he would grow bacteria in the presence of certain sugars, and then he said, well, what happens in certain combinations? And with certain combinations, like this one, the bacteria just grow exponentially, and then they level off when the medium's exhausted. And he noticed that the curve looked a little different in the presence of glucose and inositol, another sugar. Now, there's a bunch of scientists in the audience, and I'll at least confess, and maybe I'll speak for some others, that if you got a curve like this, we'd probably just connect these points and kind of smooth that baby out. But I might be admitting too much, but okay. But Jacques saw this little hump here, and he thought, mon Dieu, what is the little hump? That's not exactly what he said, but anyway, what is the little hump? It's in his notebook. What is this? And he thought, it looks like the bacteria start to grow and they level off a little bit and then they start to grow a little bit more. And he called this phenomenon dioxy, or double growth. And the pursuit of that little hump in the growth curve would lead to a Nobel Prize 25 years later. Okay? So always look carefully at your data, kids. But it almost didn't happen. And the reason why it almost didn't happen is that as the time passed to just the next month in December, and they put out the first issue of this newsletter where they were going to share this information. And they called their newsletter Resistance, right? So it was a little more than a newsletter. It was a way to kind of rally people's spirits who are, of course, feeling incredibly shocked and defeated from the rapid fall of France. Give you a little sense of the tone of this. Resist. This is the cry that comes from the hearts of all of you who suffer from our country's disaster. This is the wish of all of you who want to do your duty, but you feel isolated and disarmed. Resistance is here to speak to your hearts and minds, to show you what to do. Okay? Unfortunately, mistakes were made with this very first newsletter. They gave the stencils to some eager young Frenchmen who got caught red-handed making copies of it. And when one of those people was interrogated, they found on him a list of names. These are names and addresses of people who were to be given copies of the newsletter for further distribution. And if you run your eye down these names to about the 15th on the list, there's Jacques Monod. And it says the Laboratory of Zoology, the Sorbonne, and he prefers to be contacted between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. I don't know why. And the number 20 there was the number of copies he was supposed to get. So in this case, this is the milice, which is working hand in hand with the Gestapo, sort of the French police. So they go out immediately and they search the addresses, places of work, and homes of all the people on this list immediately. Jacques' lucky. He had not received copies yet. So when they searched his home and when they searched his lab, they found nothing. So they didn't have anything to charge him with. He was just on a list, okay? His friend Nordman, however, was not so lucky. When they searched Nordman's apartment, not only did they find a stack of these newsletters, they found that he was trying to recruit other Frenchmen to the Free French, which had formed in Britain under de Gaulle, and that he was even making reports of like local German installations and passing those on through the chain to the Allies. And so Nordman was arrested. Nordman was also Jewish, so he was shown no mercy. And he was among the first group of resistance that were executed in February 1942. Nordman and 6 others were executed. And this taught Jacques a very, very valuable lesson, which was, this little newsletter they were doing, which was really passing information or whatever, it was one of the first signs of some resistance against the authorities, and it was obviously dealt with harshly. And if they're going to do anything else, they're going to have to be very, very careful about security. So Jacques poured himself into the lab, finished his PhD, defended his PhD, and during this time, things got even worse in Paris. So there were various ordinances issued to control the freedoms and movements of French Jews. That included, for example, barring them from telephone booths, barring them from restaurants, barring them from the metro at certain times a day, and then the notorious Yellow Star, followed by these even worse scene of deportations. So Odette and Jacques had to make a decision, and they decided that Odette would not wear the Yellow Star, which was very brave, but very risky. So risky, they thought the best thing to do was to get Odette out of Paris, far south, because at this time the Germans did not occupy the far south of France, and that's where Jacques' family was. And so they arranged to get Odette. There was a border she had to cross to get to the unoccupied part of France with the 2 boys. So that's Olivier and Philippe, the twin boys. And the way they got her across the border, kind of clever, and I can't believe I got this in my document search. This is Odette's fake ID card. The one thing that's changed here, so her last name was Bruhl, B-R-U-H-L, and they changed the spelling to B-R-U-L-L-E, which I guess is the Christian spelling, and she made it across the border. And once the kids were safe across the border with family in the south, Jacques decided it was time to rejoin the resistance, and in fact to join the most militant resistance group in France. And that was called the FTP, or the Front Tireur et Partisans. They were a communist-led group, and Jacques learned right away 2 things. First was that if you weren't a member of the Communist Party, you would virtually have no say in what the group did or didn't do. So very reluctantly, because he had some reservations about the French Communist Party, he joined the party. And the second thing he learned was that the resistance was woefully short of material. So he volunteered to undertake a mission to neutral Switzerland to get material for the resistance. And what he was going to have to do is go from Paris to this little town of Annemasse on the border to get into Switzerland, where essentially the organization that was the forerunner of the CIA had set up to sort of use neutral Switzerland to aid the resistance movement. And he was seeking arms through like arms drops, ammunition, explosives, ration cards, because the resistance folks had to sort of be on the lam and be underground, and so, but they needed to eat. They, of course, needed money to live by. And the argument being made to the Allies was that essentially the resistance, a well-armed resistance, was like having a landed army in the anticipation that someday the Allies would come back to the continent and invade and retake France from the Germans, that the resistance would be there to help as essentially an already landed army if it was well supplied. So he had to make this trip to Annemasse and then across the border. And this was incredibly dangerous. This border was carefully monitored and guarded, so dangerous that as Jacques was leaving, he went to one of the members of his choir, a young music student named Geneviève Neuflar, and said, "Could you please take my briefcase? I have to go do something. And if I'm not back in 5 or 6 days, please give it to my wife and tell her that I didn't make it back." And of course, he wasn't going to tell her exactly what he was doing, but Geneviève was pretty savvy to things, and so she knew something was up. So Jacques made it across the border and back. It turns out some of the people he traveled with didn't, but he was able to make his way all the way back to Paris and successfully make contact with the Allies in Switzerland and arrange for some help. And when he got back, as soon as he got back, Geneviève said, "I want in." Or in the slang of the time, to entrer dans le bain, to get into the bath. Geneviève had been doing things sort of informally. There was a lot of sort of informal resistance to the Germans, but she understood that as things were getting serious, this is 1943, there was certainly the anticipation that there was going to be all-out war on French soil at some point, and she wanted to be part of helping to win that. And what did that entail? So what Geneviève became was called the liaison agent for Jacques. And what this was someone who would go around Paris, for example. She'd bicycle around Paris virtually every day to 10 or 12 prearranged rendezvous. She had an alias. When she was meeting, had an alias. And this is where documents, instructions, orders, et cetera, were going to be exchanged. She had to memorize all these places, not write them down. She had to memorize all these names, not write them down, and make this tour, and then bring that information back to Jacques at night, where they would decide what else to do. And some of this involved, for example, action plans. So here, for example, is the map of an electrical plant that actually Geneviève gave me. And this is, for example, to be passed on to the Allies, either to be bombed or for sabotage. Also, after the invasion of Normandy, it was really important. Resistance played a big role in delaying movements of troops around Germany, German troops around France, to hinder the response to the invasion. And this is an order from Jacques describing a new technique for sabotaging trains. And the idea is if you sort of cut the cable in the right way, it was undetectable in the station, but the train, once it made it quarter mile, half mile out of the station, would stall on the tracks and block further movement. Now, I told you that this is an order from Jacques. Now, first of all, when you say an order from Jacques, he went from, why am I saying he's giving orders? Why is he giving orders? Well, he keeps rising in the ranks of the resistance pretty much by attrition, because even up to, for example, this is incredibly dangerous work, and the technique that Germans had, the Gestapo in particular, was that when they caught anybody, they would torture the bejesus out of them to get the names of other people, and you just didn't know, who could hold up under torture and who would break. So that 3 days before the Normandy invasion, Jacques was out of town, but 11 members of the leaders of the Paris resistance were all rounded up in that sort of way. And Jacques didn't know whether, for example, his name would be given up by any of those 11 people. So he had to be incredibly careful. And by that time, he was sleeping in safe houses. He was wearing a disguise. He was still trying to carry on a little bit of lab work at times, but that was pretty hard to do. And I keep telling you this is an order from Jacques, but you see, he of course doesn't sign his real name. A little insight into Jacques' personality. When he joined, he took the alias Malaver, and when he joined the FTP, he wasn't sure if they were really going to be effective. So he picked as an alias the name of a fictional character from a novel who was impotent. Okay? It's a long way to go for a joke. But, and especially think of that, a French man taking a joke. Okay, never mind. You get the point. So, but this is a dead serious business. Here's another order from Jacques. Here he is ordering the execution of someone named Bruchy. So he's a patron of this bar, the Express, in a particular street in Paris. And he said, let the executioners know, let the people carrying this out know that he's very dangerous and he might already have been informed ahead of time that this decision has been made. Again, signed Malaver, okay? And you guys think peer review is tough, right? Okay. So, so this is July. As August starts to arrive, the Allies are making progress coming from Normandy across France, but the decision made by Eisenhower is to go around Paris. He can't deal with 3 million people living in Paris, does not want to do door-to-door fighting in Paris, doesn't want to deal with the destruction of the city of Paris, which he figures if the Germans make a stand there, they'll have to reduce the city to rubble, and that was not what Eisenhower wants to move quickly towards Germany, encircle Paris, and just keep right on going. But the resistance has different ideas. They see the Allies making progress. They want Paris to be liberated, so they start to take things in their own hands. And what that means is, for example, attacking well-fortified German installations in the city. So, for example, and even though there's tanks and heavy weaponry and all that sort of thing, the resistance is trying to take back the police station and things like this. And Jacques is really worried. He feels that the resistance is going to get annihilated if they go up against these stronger forces. But there may be ways to at least harass the Germans and maybe get the upper hand on them a little bit if they change their tactics. So one morning in August, he suggests SS Geneviève to take down an order. Now, by this time, Jacques is a high-ranking officer in sort of the overall national French resistance called the FFI. This is his ID card. I like to show it because this is, I think, his Willem Dafoe badass-looking phase. But I also want to show you because he holds ID card, if I can pick this out, number 2, okay? Again, by attrition, this is probably not the way you want to be promoted. So he issues this order. And let me tell you the substance of it. So he suggests, this is an order to build barricades, dated August 20th, 1944, to build wherever possible, beginning with the large main streets frequented by enemy patrols. Barricades that are powerful enough to stop automobiles, trucks, and scout cars with machine guns. These barricades should be built with twists and turns that allow the passage of friendly patrols. They should be defended by armed groups that will have the mission of preventing enemy vehicles from penetrating the barricades. And the population should be encouraged by means of posters and loudspeakers mounted on cars to participate in the construction of the barricades. It's actually an old technique that's been used in France. And when he finishes sort of dictating this order, he turns to Geneviève. He says, it's too bad. This will never be followed. But, it just might work. And 2 days later, this is the scene on the streets of Paris. And the citizenry took heed. There were posters and loudspeakers encouraging this. They're chopping down trees, blocking roads, chopping up cobblestones, bringing old furniture out, cars that have no petrol, sandbags. And you see everyone's involved, men, women, children, all contributing to the building of the barricades. This is a film taken by the resistance. And you'll see in a second the structures they build, which are these little offset barricades where, like this is on a bridge in Paris, so that if a car goes across, it has to sort of slow down for the first barricade, swoop out and go around. Well, that gives them a chance for ambush. And you can see when that car just passed, you see the resistance opening up. And the other thing is Molotov cocktails are being manufactured in labs across Paris at this time, taken through underground tunnels. and from the tops of buildings and from open windows being dropped on, for example, troop vehicles and things like that, or thrown in the vents of tanks and things. So it's a pretty tough hand-to-hand sort of situation, but that's what's going on in Paris for a few days, and Eisenhower decides we're going to have to go to Paris, and led by French troops, putting French troops in the front, led by General Leclerc, on night of August 24th, morning of August 25th, French troops enter the capital. And this is a copy of a underground, up until that time, an underground newspaper called Combat, published by one of the resistance groups, declaring that French troops had entered into the liberated capital. And I want to give you a little flavor of this. This was entirely underground for about 2 years, but in the last few days, during the battle for Paris, bicyclists were distributing them just by essentially, throwing them across Paris in the air and letting people pick these things up. But every day in Combat, there was an editorial, generally in the front left column. And this editorial on this August 25th, which has to be the happiest, most glorious day in the history of this incredibly fantastic city, called the Night of Truth. And I'll just give you a little excerpt from that and translation of that editorial, which says, 4 years ago, a few men rose up amid the ruins in despair and quietly proclaimed that nothing was lost yet. They said that the war must go on, that the forces of good could always triumph over the forces of evil, provided the price was paid. They paid that price. And a couple days after the liberation of Paris, the author of this editorial and so many others revealed himself, and that person was Albert Camus. And he instantly became a national hero and a national voice. So Monod, once Paris was liberated, he kept serving with the French army through to the victory over Germany. But once the war was over, I realized really the first 6 years of his marriage, the first 5 to 6 years of his kids' lives, was just dominated by this war. And he said he just wanted to pull a curtain over the whole thing and just hurl himself back into science. And he hired a technician, and he told this technician, now at the Pasteur Institute, he said, I'm in search of the secrets of life. So circa 1945, what were some of the important secrets of life to be understood? Well, the first was, what are genes made of? And the second, how do genes work to specify the properties of living things? And late in the war, as Monod, believe it or not, learned from a bookmobile of the U.S. Army when he was out east of Paris, headed towards Germany, he's reading scientific journals in a U.S. Army bookmobile, and he comes across this paper by Oswald Avery and colleagues, demonstrating that DNA is the carrier of genetic information, a classic paper from late 1944. So that was one of the exciting developments. And among all these exciting developments, Jacques has made some of his own. He did some experiments late in the period of the war, despite all of his duties, with a graduate student named Alice Odereau. And you got to realize at this time there was very little formal genetics, let alone genetics of bacteria, because some people didn't think that bacteria had genes. Okay, but he demonstrated that they did have genes because they isolated a strain that could not utilize lactose. Remember all these experiments he's doing with sugar. Now, little footnote, this strain that could not utilize lactose came from a stool sample from his boss. Okay? So, and again, would contribute to the Nobel Prize. So, it's a punchline that writes itself. I don't think I have to give it to you. Okay. In this sample, they observed, however, rare, sort of randomly distributed colonies that could utilize lactose. And they appeared, this is a photograph from those times, on a lawn of bacteria, these little buttons that grew on otherwise bacteria that were struggling to grow on the medium. And they showed that these colonies were due to spontaneous mutations that stably reversed the defect in the original strains. And when you plated them out, they could utilize lactose. So this was just a very early experiment in bacterial genetics. So 1946, Monod knows a lot of things are going on in the United States. Science in the United States is going to be in better shape because of our success in the war and the fact that we were not bombed as England or France was. So here he is at a meeting at a seminal place in biology in America, the Cold Spring Harbor Lab, talking genetics with Barbara McClintock, who's a future Nobel laureate herself. This meeting had maybe 75 or 80 participants. I think that there are 8 or 9 future Nobel laureates there, all talking about genes and the mysteries of heredity. So Jacques goes back to France, really energized. He's also gotten commitments at that time from the Rockefeller Foundation to help rebuild French science. So modern equipment and things like that. This is really going to jumpstart science again in France, and especially at the Pasteur Institute. And then one day, 1948, he's reading a French newspaper. This happens to be a French communist newspaper that heralds a great scientific event, stating that heredity is not controlled by mysterious factors, okay? And he thinks, oh, well, there must have been some breakthrough in the Soviet Union. He's reading about this story coming out of the Soviet Union. And certainly before the war, there was a lot of excellent Russian geneticists. But as he reads on, it's not the breakthrough that he's reading about. He becomes increasingly more horrified. And that's because it's an account of a meeting of the Soviet Academy called by this fellow named T.D. Lysenko, who was Stalin's appointed sort of czar of agriculture and de facto essentially head of biology in the Soviet Union. And Lysenko, and this was that the article was reporting, was calling for a reform of Soviet biology. So at the same time, there's a big cultural movement in the Soviet Union to sort of Sovietize everything, to reject ideas from the West, to rename things that might have Western names, and to sort of to infuse Soviet culture with sort of Soviet heroes and claims. And he claimed from his own experiments that traits that were produced by manipulating the environment, in this case in plants, could be inherited by subsequent generations of plants. And on this basis, he argued that Mendelian and Morganist genetics was erroneous and must be abandoned. And let me underscore what abandon meant in the Soviet Union, in Stalin's Soviet Union at the time. It was abandon or else. There was a Soviet way of doing things. It was Lysenko's way. And the pressure here was really to feed the Soviet people. As you know, in the West, we did crop modification by classic breeding and selection experiments. Well, Lysenko had Stalin's ear and was telling Stalin that you could even transform one plant species into another just by the conditions under which you grew it, things like this. So abandoning Mendelian genetics and Morgan genetics had to happen. It was bourgeois genetics and should be dismissed. So Monod figures, I got to learn more about this Lysenko character. Where is he coming from? So he starts reading massively. He's got a colleague that understands Russian, and he's helping to translate documents. And it turns out, of all things, the crucial dispute here involves the role of chance. Lysenko contends that because mutations are unforeseeable, they lack a material basis. They're miracles. Now, what he means by this, many of you who've practiced biology know that, on a lawn of bacteria, you don't know which one may be resistant to an antibiotic or to a virus infection. If you plant a row of crops, maybe that have colored flowers, you don't know which one's going to pop up with a mutant color or something like that. They arise at random and then are the subject possibly for selective breeding. But Lysenko argues that because they're not foreseeable, they lack a material basis. And he argues that by ridding our science of Mendelism and Morganism, we rid it of chance. Sciences such as those of physics and chemistry are rid of chance. Any physicists in the audience will know that that's smoldering bullshit. It is for this reason that they have become exact sciences. So Monod figures out that Lysenko is, just what I said. But he had more elegant ways of saying it. But where's he going to say it? Okay, here's an academic biologist, 1948. He's only had his PhD a few years. He's thinking that this Lysenko, and this, you got to understand, I should add to you, is that the Communist Party is really powerful in France. It's probably has 25% of the population, is committed to it. Lots of academics are members of the Communist Party. Members of Monod's family are members of the Communist Party. And the Communist Party of France led really the resistance. So it was, doing well, controlled the labor unions in France, et cetera. And a lot of Frenchmen, it was expected that you would toe the party line of whatever was coming out of Moscow. So this conflict was, for a lot of French people, a lot bigger than just the issue of chance. So what's Monod going to do? Well, he writes what is, to my knowledge, essentially the only op-ed he wrote in his entire career. And he puts it in this newspaper, Combat, that is now a regular above-ground newspaper. And he writes pretty much an autopsy on Lysenko. Lysenko's victory has no scientific basis whatsoever. His truth is the official truth guaranteed by the state. His opponents who defend science are practically accused of treason. All this is senseless, monstrous, unbelievable, a sign of the mortal decay into which socialist thought has fallen in the Soviet Union. Okay, Jacques, but what's your real criticism? Okay. So this was front page news in Paris in France in 1948, and internationally people were paying attention because this was really a condemnation of the Soviet method of doing things. Well, this was a pivotal episode because this single article brought several really important people into Monod's life. The first of whom was Camus, who was having his own thoughts. He was working on his own devastating critique of the Soviet system, which would come out as a book called L'Homme Révolté, or known as The Rebel. And I won't get into this. The two men were introduced to each other. They had a lot in common, of course, with Camus' background in the resistance, Monod's background in the resistance. They hit it off right away. They had a lot of conversations, as reflected by this little excerpt I put in the right, which pops up in L'Homme Révolté, and I feel really confident that Albert Camus did not come up with this on his own, when he said, "For Marxism to remain infallible, it has been therefore necessary to deny all biological discoveries made since Darwin. All discoveries since have consisted in introducing the idea of chance into biology." And he said more. And in Monod's personal copy of L'Homme Révolté, there's a nice warm inscription from Albert Camus saying, "To Jacques Monod, this answer to a few of our questions, fraternally Albert Camus." So each was committed, having been through World War II and seeing where Hitler's ideology led, they saw Stalin as the same sort of global threat. And that was confirmed for them, particularly by the way the Soviet Union crushed the Hungarian revolution in 1956, which looked for a little while like it might be allowed to happen, but then was crushed with tanks. And Monod and Camus took their respective paths, Camus writing a lot, trying to make appeals for the freedom of writers and artists that were in Hungary. And Monod got in the business of human smuggling because that article on Lysenko led a Hungarian biochemist named Agnes Ullmann to visit Monod's lab in 1958, briefly. He was the only Western scientist whose name she knew. So she read this editorial and said, "I have to meet this man," went to Paris. She reveals how unhappy she is in Hungary behind the Iron Curtain, and Monod simply asks, do you want to be free? And she says, yes. He says, okay, then I'll work on it. And for the next 2 years, he works on getting Agnes and her husband out of Hungary at a time when no one was getting across that border. And I'm not going to tell you how she got out. It's in the book. I'm not trying to sell books, but I don't want to spoil plots left and right, okay? But I will tell you that one way they communicated, again, I'm not making this up because the evidence I've seen with my own eyes, Agnes was a biochemist, extremely talented biochemist who came this close to discovering messenger RNA. And Agnes taught Jacques how to write in invisible ink, which means writing in a starch solution and then developing it with an iodide solution. And she's sending messages. Their superficial letters are all about their mutual love of music. So she's sending Bela Bartok albums where there's messages written in starch on the inside cover, where they're trying to work out a scheme for how to actually smuggle her out of Hungary. This is all going on in a 2-year period, which is Monod's most productive, creative, and impactful period of his scientific career. And that's thanks to a third person who's brought in by that Lysenko article, Francois Jacob. Makes me think I should write more op-eds, but okay. Jacob was a 20-year-old medical student when the war broke out, fled to the coast, got to Britain, joined de Gaulle's Free French forces, served as a medic across North Africa for 4 years, came back ashore in Normandy in August, and was nearly killed in a dive bomb attack. So badly wounded that he had to give up his medical career. He wanted to be a surgeon, but he was just too badly wounded. But this now being the era of antibiotics, and he's seeing these debates about genetics in the popular press in France, he thinks, I want to get into science. And after lots and lots of efforts, he finally gets into the Pasteur Institute, and they essentially assign him a lab space right next to Monod. And not only do they hit it off personally, But they hit it off creatively in one of the most marvelous collaborations that's happened in the history of biology. And they collaborate to figure out really that puzzle that was going on for Monod 20 years earlier, which is that little inflection in that growth curve, which has to do with how bacteria know when a certain sugar is in the medium to turn on certain genes to metabolize it. So that little hump reflects the fact that what the bacteria were doing was using one sugar up completely, and then when that sugar was exhausted, switching to using the other sugar. And the question of how bacteria know to turn on the right genes to metabolize a sugar has to do with a concept I'll just refer to as the genetic switch, where the genes for metabolizing lactose are turned on in the presence of sugar, and they're kept off when it's absent. And this becomes a paradigm for understanding how genes are regulated in all living things. And for that work, Jacob and Monod, and Monod's boss at the Pasteur Institute and the source of the stool sample, and a bit more, share the Nobel Prize. And this is an incredibly great event for France. Been a while since they had seen Nobels, let alone sweeping the physiology or medicine Nobel, with three people that just had great backstories. Jacob is a decorated, highly decorated veteran. Like the top 1,000 people that went off with de Gaulle were honored in a special order. Jacob was a member of that. Monod, obviously a member of the resistance. Lvoff was also in the resistance, but for example, he was a really talented artist. They're all family men. Monod's a sailor, handsome guys, et cetera. It was great copy, okay? So they're instantly on the cover of magazines and newspapers in France and sought out for interviews. But of all three of them, the one who was most prepared for sort of the public limelight and to use it was Jacques Monod. And so for example, when Martin Luther King visited Paris the next year on a fundraising trip, it was Monod who introduced Martin Luther King to a star-studded audience of about 5,000 Parisians. And here you can see backstage, there's Harry Belafonte, there's the actor Yves Montand, there's Dr. King, there's Coretta Scott King. And so Monod gave the introduction. This is probably something that would have fallen to his friend Camus, but Camus tragically died in a car accident several years earlier. So in many ways, I think Monod was taking on the mantle of his friend Camus in sort of some public affairs. When Dr. King was assassinated 2 years later, it's Monod that gave the eulogy in Paris and disclosed during that eulogy that King had told him a couple years earlier that he actually expected to be assassinated. In 1968, not long after Dr. King's assassination, huge riots broke out in Paris, led especially in the student quarter, almost overthrew the government in May of 1968. And who was in the newspapers every day? And here you see Jacques Monod escorting a wounded student out from the Latin Quarter in Paris. He was a go-between the government and the students during this time, quoted in the newspaper every day. So here you've got this prominent, scientific public figure, a war hero, a Nobel laureate, sort of on the right side of issues of the day. And several of his friends encouraged him to run for president against de Gaulle. A scientist as president. Can you imagine? Okay. So Jacques decided eventually not to run, but he'd been thinking a great deal about what science could offer for the betterment of society, and he was certainly willing to campaign for that. And Monod, having then been a leader of the revolution in biology that had revealed the structure of DNA, the universal genetic code, the logic of genetic switches, and having been an eyewitness to dangerous dogmas that killed tens of millions of people, enslaved many more, he turned to consider the broader applications of the discoveries of molecular biology. And he really felt that biologists had not yet been given a sort of a seat at the philosophers or the theologians' table. And he said, the secret of life had been laid bare. This, a considerable event, ought certainly to make itself strongly felt in contemporary thinking. So he put his thoughts together in this book called Chance and Necessity, published in 1970. Remarkably, it rose to be a bestseller, a #2 bestseller in France. Only #2 to, and I'm not making this up, Love Story. Okay. He said, man was the product of we understand, on the basis of understanding the mechanism of mutation, man was the product of an incalculable number of fortuitous events the result of a huge Monte Carlo game where our number eventually did come out when it might not well have appeared. He felt that this perspective coming from molecular biology was just completely absent in sort of, among public intellectuals. And so he hoped to change that really with chance and necessity. And really everything we had learned, about mutation since certainly validates Jacques' view, as he said, quote, "Chance alone is at the source of every innovation, of all creation in the biosphere. This central concept of modern biology is no longer one among other possible hypotheses. It's the only one that squares with observed and tested fact. Nothing warrants the hope that on this score our position is likely ever to be revised." He adds, "There's no scientific concept in any of the sciences more destructive of anthropocentrism than this one." He was pretty good at drilling it home. Okay, so he's really basing his argument, understanding now the relationship of the structure of DNA, the nature of the genetic code, the nature of mutation, which is a random change in the sequence of that polymer DNA, and that all life and all differences among life have to do with changes that have taken place in that DNA, that changes in DNA are the process of evolution itself, that all diversity in the biosphere, all novelty in the biosphere is ultimately the result of chance. And this, of course, was threatening to thousands of years of thought. Now, everything we've learned, this is 1970, these are early days. There's still a lot to go on in molecular biology. But everything we've learned since then about mutation and evolution squares with Monod's position. And Fred even referred to one of the surprising discoveries that followed Monod's book by about a decade that have only reinforced our notion that we live in a world dominated by chance, such as the discovery, for example, of the KT asteroid impact in 1980 by Louis and Walter Alvarez and colleagues. And I think most of us know that story, but the idea is that
the energy released would be equal to
traveling about 50,000 miles an hour, entered the atmosphere and struck the Yucatan Peninsula, and that impact blasted enormous amounts of rock into and out of the atmosphere, which fell back as trillions of tiny red-hot meteors, triggering wildfires across the globe. Soot from those wildfires, sulfur vapor liberated by the impact, blocked out the sun for probably 10 to 30 years, shutting down production on land and in the oceans, and led to either immediately or in time to the extinction of about 3/4 of all species on the planet. And as Fred also mentioned, geologists now come to appreciate that impact site in Yucatan mattered because perhaps, between 1 and 10% of the Earth's surface has the kind of rocks that when struck could liberate the sort of vapors, sulfur vapor, et cetera, that could lead to a mass extinction. So in fact, had that asteroid entered the atmosphere 30 minutes earlier, it hits the Atlantic, 30 minutes later, it hits the Pacific, and there probably would be no mass extinction, and the dinosaurs would still be here, and we would not be. So from the molecular to the planetary scale, we see the power of chance. And, Jacques, in sort of a Camusian way, wanted to wrestle with how do we deal with this knowledge? And this is, if you know Camus, this is an extremely Camusian phrase. Man knows at last that he's alone in the universe's unfeeling immensity out of which he emerged only by chance. His destiny is nowhere spelled out, nor is his duty. So how do we live with this knowledge of the massive role of chance in our own existence? Well, Jacques, after the publication of the book, he becomes director of the Pasteur Institute. A few years later, he becomes diagnosed with aplastic anemia, and every few days he needs a transfusion to keep going. And despite that struggle, his directorial duties, his illness, he still took time to sort of answer some of these profound questions, particularly when they came from a 13-year-old boy in Grenoble. So in January 1976, a young man writes Monod and says, "Sir, I'm a 13-year-old boy who's very interested in research. I know that you're one of the greatest researchers in the world. Our professor of science told us so. Excuse me for bothering you, but I'd like to know what maxim guides your life. Perhaps I could apply that when I grow up. Goodbye, Monsieur Monod, and Happy New Year, 1976. Bruno." Jacques answers, "My dear Bruno, all I can tell you are the qualities that appear most important to me. If one were to pose this question to me, I would reply without a doubt that they are courage, as much moral as physical, as well as the love of truth, or rather the hatred of lies. Thank you for the New Year's wishes. Happy New Year to you, Jacques Monod." He passed away about 4 months later. So that's the story I wanted to tell you, but the only way I'm able to tell you that story is because of certain special people that shared with me their experiences with Minot, gave me incredible documents, etc. So I just want to acknowledge them. This is Geneviève Nuflard in 1943. This is Geneviève Nuflard in 2013. Geneviève, at the end of World War II in 1945, sat down to write a memoir immediately while her memories were fresh of what she and Jacques were up to in the resistance. She never published it. She handed it to me and said, use it as you will. Great stories in there, amazing, an amazing person. She had a great career. She was a professional musician, a flautist. She had a fantastic career. She did pass away a couple years ago, but through her 90s, sharp as a tack, funny, had some great stories about other things she did to confound the Germans. Agnes Ullmann, shown here in 1958, shown maybe 50 years later at the Pasteur Institute. Once she was smuggled out of Hungary, she became a lifelong member of the Pasteur Institute. And she was sort of the keeper of all knowledge around Minot and Jacob and others. Again, unfortunately, Agnes passed away a couple of years ago, which is also sort of a reminder to all you folks, and I met some history students today, et cetera. These stories don't last forever. The archives can disappear. The first-person witnesses can disappear. I'm happy to say that of the both Minot children are alive. Here's Olivier hiding behind his brother. Here's Olivier with me in Paris. Olivier shared family letters, his father's copies of books, all his recollections of growing up with Jacques and all his friends. And all these people were instrumental to bringing out a story that I don't think would have been told and now probably couldn't have been told. Thanks for listening.
Marvelous, marvelous. We have time for some questions. Anybody?
I'm more interested in the Pasteur Institute under Minot and what can be said for how he advanced that institute or sustained it, despite certain economic challenges of France and the like.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's kind of a mixed review of that. Pasteur was in trouble, and the Pasteur was a unique institution. For a long time, it had far-flung institutes across the world. It was a leader in understanding, particularly the origin of lots of diseases. There are many luminaries, including, of course, Louis Pasteur himself. And Jacques felt that the Pasteur, really made his career possible and created the environment for this, these fantastic collaborations. So he felt a duty to take on this leadership of the Pasteur, which meant, stepping away from his science and some other things he was doing. There were some tough decisions to be made. You mentioned the financial condition of the Pasteur. There were a lot of people who were there, kind of lifelong appointees that maybe were not so productive, and Jacques had to kind of deal with some of the personnel and political issues going on at the Pasteur, and he was not necessarily incredibly patient and I'm not saying he wasn't diplomatic, because he was a charming guy, but I don't think he had a lot of patience for folks who had kind of overstayed their productivity at the Pasteur. So it was a bit of a rough time. I think there was a lot, to go from sort of, where he was as so admired, and then, it's not easy to be an administrator and be so admired. You're going to make some tough decisions. You're going to make people angry. So that was part of his experience of being the Pasteur. But I think the Pasteur has, of course, endured. So I think part of the verdict is he took the helm at a critical time, but it was rough seas for most of that time. Is that?
Yeah, I fathom that, but his research then took a back seat.
Oh, far back seat, yeah. His research took a far, I'll try to repeat the question, yeah. Yeah, his research took a far back seat, but I think at the time, he was 61 when he took the directorship of the Pasteur. He felt a huge obligation to this institute. And, he was asked, to take this. And, I think that there's, of course, times where scientists are going to decide. I've kind of made my greatest contributions, my next contribution is to the institutions and to the next generations of scientists. So I think he undertook that evolution. And, having written the book, become even more of a public figure, he was in the position to talk to the government, to talk to others about, how to keep the Pasteur as a, really just one of the shining lights of French science and French biology in particular. So that was certainly his aim, but it was a rough time. Yeah.
Did his break with Marxism come after the war, before he had the disagreement with the intractability?
Yeah, he was reluctant. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. He was reluctant to join the communists to begin with. I think he had a visceral aversion to dogma, and there was a lot of dogma coming out of the Communist Party. And so he joined as a matter of, practical matter for during the war, and then he just let his membership lapse. He didn't make it with any big fanfare because it was sensitive. So for example, his immediate supervisor at the Sorbonne was prominent, a communist, had been captured and deported during the war and suffered terribly, but happened to have survived. I think it was better to kind of let that slip quietly. His brother-in-law was a strong Communist Party member, so there were sort of family things to not make a big deal. But once Lysenko was in the public realm, the gloves were off, and he made it really clear where he stood. In fact, he was preceded the day before or 2 days before in combat by that same person, his former boss who had been captured and deported, who wrote a pretty kind of keeping one side on each, one foot in each camp, and that just wasn't gonna square. So this was tough for a lot of French academics of what to do about the French Communist Party, and it was true for a lot of the intellectuals. When Camus wrote his essentially expose of Soviet-style communism, that was his break with a lot of the French left, including most famously Jean-Paul Sartre. So as some of Camus' friends were abandoning him, here was his new friend Monod, and they were, completely aligned in the way they were seeing things. So I think that was also part of the warmth of that friendship, was that Monod was sticking his neck out, but much more prominent people like Camus already had their neck out, and then Camus really respected Jacques, and I think loved the fact that Jacques was coming from like a science angle and not from philosophy or political science or things like that. So that's my sense of the bond they had. And I think whatever they were saying in 1951 or 1952, the Hungarian situation pretty much proved the point, which was meet the new boss. It's the same as the old boss, which was, crush all dissent. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was amazing talking. It's good to be here and hear this in person. It's not very often that we kind of get the director's cut or the behind-the-scenes look behind these scientific, historically groundbreaking moments. And I'm wondering personally, what was it like with this journey of telling this great story? Were you met with a lot of resistance, or how was it putting this story together, meeting people like Olivier and Jean-Pierre?
Yeah.
How was that for you?
It was one of the greatest adventures of my life.
Yeah.
I never in my scientific imagination, and certainly not, as a kid catching snakes in Toledo, Ohio, did I imagine sitting in the living room of Geneviève Nuflard talking about how to beat the Nazis. And these people, had such both dignity and modesty about them. Agnes, Geneviève, obviously Jacques had passed away, so I never met Jacques Monod. They did what they felt they had to do, right? To live life and to rise up against what they were facing. So, I especially mentioned Geneviève and Agnes because I spent so much time with them, and they were so key to helping to tell this story. But they introduced me to a whole circle of people, and these people who shared those experiences during the war, or in facing up against Stalin. It was this amazing experience. And as a researcher, storyteller, the great part of the adventure was pieces of this story just kind of fell into my hands over a period of time with police archive papers that I just was playing a hunch and found them one day and, lost my breath essentially in the archives. And Olivier finding letters between Jacques and his mom he didn't know existed. And Agnes's story of being smuggled out of Hungary, she had never told before, ever. 50 years had passed, as she said. It still made her heart race and made her nervous to talk about it. But she, over time, I guess, and Agnes, I had several picnics, or picnics, as I told students earlier today, in Agnes's apartment. An Agnes picnic, you have to have some stamina because it opens with a couple double shots of whiskey, and then the Cabernet opens, and it's just me and her, and she's 80-something, and I'm already half in the bag by 7 o'clock. And it's baguettes this long, and it's 4 or 5 different French cheeses, and then it's more wine. And then she let me tell her story. Exactly. To meet these people and to get their trust, to have them trust me, pretty amazing. Thank you. And it's been 10 years, and I'm a little touched thinking about it. Yeah.
One more
question? One or two? We'll get two, and I'll be shorter in the answer. He's not in charge anymore. I'm on my own. You're on your own time right now, right? This thing's over, and this is just overtime. Go ahead. Yeah.
I want to go back to the letter to the boy.
Yeah.
He said like 2 characteristics of the person who is pursuing science. Because like he needs to have courage and the desire to the truth. Would you, as a person and as a scientist, to add some characteristics, like, or if no, could you like share the advice to the undergraduate or graduate student?
Okay, if everyone heard the question, would I add anything to Monod's thinking the key characteristics are courage and the love of truth, and would I add anything for the students in the room to that? Boy, I thought courage and the love of truth was pretty good and timeless. There's not an accident why I'm still telling this story in 2023, right? It helps to have the passion, the curiosity, the resilience, etc. But I think, in this world, we're kind of short on courage. We're kind of short on the courage to tell the truth. And we're also a little short on hope. And I think by telling stories about people who rose to face their circumstances, that can all inspire us to have, a little more hope. We find a little more in ourselves that we're able to face the obstacles, face the challenges personally, collectively that we're up against. And one of the reasons for telling this story is that I knew the elegant science of the operon, and I didn't know any of this. And that's only quintupled my admiration for what they accomplished as scientists. Those of you who are in graduate school, and it's rough, just be glad you're not occupied by the Nazis. Okay. This will be the last one, Fred. Is that all right? Yeah. Go ahead.
So you continue to make reference to Monod's most scientifically productive times as his most creative time. Is this your view, or do you think he also saw science as a chiefly creative endeavor? And is that perhaps motivated by his love of music, philosophy, or camaraderie with all?
Yeah. Okay. So if you heard the question is, I asserted that like period from 58 to 60 was Monod's most creative period. Is that my view? Is that a widely held view? Do you think that's a view that maybe comes from his thoughts of music and philosophy, et cetera? I think so. He and Jacob were engaged in a really intimate collaboration. I mean, daily discussion, daily design of experiments, daily interpretation of results, and they wrote, based on experiments and their thinking, a series of papers, I'd say maybe about 4 papers in a 2-year period, first in French, that is essentially you can just reconstruct it. It's the discovery of all this, of the logic of essentially of a genetic switch. All the ideas they came up with, the parts they named, are still the words we use today: promoter, operator, operon, etc. And then just to top it off, proposed the existence of messenger RNA and got that one too. So there's obviously a long build because I'm saying 58 to 60, Monod had been an independent scientist for quite a while by then. But it was especially when he and Jacob were in this daily brainstorm, experimental storm that these ideas essentially came out of nowhere. And they were really based on, there's no recombinant DNA here or anything like this, right? These are genetic experiments. They're essentially conceiving crosses of bacteria and things like this, and interpreting the results on bacterial plates and saying, oh, okay, there must be, upstream of the gene, there's something like, okay, where are they getting these ideas, right? So really remarkable imagination to picture what's going on in the cell and the logic of how this must work. And it's incredibly elegant, both reasoning, writing, and logic. So I think that's where it's exceptionally well executed and well articulated. And then, had the power that essentially the world went, holy smokes, this is how it works. And this became the paradigm for how genes were regulated ever since. And Jacob talked about that period too, and he was thinking, especially about, how do you imagine what's going on at the molecular scale when you can't see it? You can't see it with the eye. So how do you picture it, and how do you then test your picture of what it is through these experiments where you're always reading some indirect sort of surrogate of what's going on? And I think that creativity of imagining what's going on, things you can't see, yet sort of accurately describing what it is, I think we recognize that as pretty exceptional creativity. Does that get to the answer? Yeah. Okay, Fred, you want to take over? Oh, we got one more. They all want to go, but.
So I have two comments. This is wonderful. I want to tell you that Monod and Jacob live in our labs. We use, beyond this, they describe the empirical model of growth.
Yeah.
That is of eternal use for us, right?
Yeah.
So that is also a wonderful legacy from him. I want to also, ask you a question about, during the reconquer of France, there was a big role of the Spanish resistance. And kind of that part of the history is missed on your narrative.
So was that probably in the South? Yes. Yeah, in the Spanish border. Because, of course, there were resistance escape routes going through the Pyrenees into Spain, and so there must have been cooperation on both sides. Yeah.
Civil war in Spain.
Yeah.
They are escaping from.
Yeah. Do you know a good book for us all to read about the Spanish resistance? Can you recommend a good book?
I can. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Yeah. No, just I had to stay on the Minot angle of this story, and he's going east with the army.
A missing part in the story, and I think.
Yeah. Well, and I'll just kind of flavor that a little bit too, which is, it wasn't easy to figure out what Minot did in the war, because those people who essentially disavowed the Communist Party kind of got written out of the history. So not only were the communists, powerful in the resistance, but post-war, if you turned your back on them, you found yourself not being credited in their accounts of the war. And I'm holding all these documents, and I'm like, can somebody explain to me why Minot's name or his alias is on all these orders, and he's not in these books of what happened during the Paris uprising, right? And that's where Olivier sort of explains that there were hard feelings, from the communists towards those that disavowed them. I want to make one other mention for the students or anyone else in the room. You were talking about, you still use the model of growth, but all these mutants in genes called LAC-Z, and if you do blue-white selection on bacteria in your cloning, the inventor of the blue-white selection is Agnes Ullmann, okay? So this is also pretty much the foundation of recombinant DNA and genetic engineering. All these E. coli strains with these mutants that gave us selectable phenotypes, the control of gene expression, that we would induce the operon, we put genes downstream of LAC-Z, all of you that do recombinant DNA, you can recognize that 20 years of genetics out of the Pasteur Institute gave us a toolkit for manipulating genes when the recombinant DNA era came along. So huge echoes of their impact for many decades to come.
Okay,
Back to you, Fred.
We are going to have to end, but if you have a burning question, I can assure you that Sean will answer you after everything. But let's give Sean one minute.